"Get off that sidewalk. You're blinding the birds." That was the first sentence screamed at me by a woman in lavender heels wielding a laminated rule book like it was the Constitution. I hadn't even closed my car door before she declared my driveway tiles a reflective hazard to community harmony. This apparently was Karen Beauregard, HOA president, self-appointed sheriff of sidewalk gloss, and the reason I nearly choked on my moving in coffee. I came for retirement. I got a suburban boss fight. If I had known that buying a home in Silverwood Estates came with a complimentary dictator and pastel blazers, I might have just stayed in my overpriced San Francisco loft with a leaky sink and a raccoon who thought he paid rent. But there I was, Caleb Ross, 34, former tech CEO, freshly semi-retired with a neat $40 million, 0 cents exit, and the unshakable delusion that quiet suburbia meant peace. The house was perfect. 3-car garage, half-acre lawn, smart irrigation, and just enough distance from my nearest neighbor to feel like a Netflix thriller couldn't break out without me noticing. And yet, despite the electric gate and double-paned windows, I never saw her coming. Karen Beauregard introduced herself not with a handshake, but with a squint. I was checking my mailbox for my forwarded startup mail, mostly fan mail from venture capitalists who'd missed the boat, when she swooped in like a homeowners association hawk who'd sniffed an unauthorized mailbox font. "You must be the new tech person," she announced, eyeing my Tesla like it had run over her begonias. "And what do you do? Crypto?" Before I could answer, she tilted her head, examining my sidewalk. "Are you aware the reflective index of your driveway tile exceeds the HOA's allowance during spring months?" I blinked. The reflective what now? I'd once argued down a Saudi telecom exec over AI licensing in Dubai. But this woman, she had weaponized HOA laws the way the CIA uses drones. I smiled and extended my hand. "Caleb Ross, just moved in yesterday." She stared at it like I'd offered her a diseased squirrel. "Silverwood typically attracts a more mature demographic," she said, eyes narrowing. "People who appreciate order, tradition, not flashy tech money." Then, with all the warmth of a malfunctioning Roomba, she added, "We don't get many people your age around here. I hope you've reviewed the homeowner standards. We take them seriously." She pivoted on one orthopedic heel and marched away, leaving me with the distinct impression that I had just failed an entrance exam I never knew I signed up for. That night, I stared at my unpacked boxes and wondered if I'd just traded venture capital chaos for final fence fascism. I had expected a few over 50 folks with bird feeders and unsolicited book club invites. What I got was surveillance disguised as neighborliness and unsolicited lectures on shutter colors. Still, I'd brushed it off. I'd handled boardroom betrayals, patent trolls, and an engineer who tried to unionize my espresso machine. I figured one cranky HOA president couldn't be that bad. But then came the note, printed on embossed cream paper tucked under my doormat. "Welcome to Silverwood. Friendly reminder, solar panels must not exceed 11 DE tilt. See Section 12.3 of the Design Harmony Manifesto." That's when I realized I wasn't living in a community. I had moved into a regime. And yet there was something strangely fascinating about Karen Beauregard. She ran Silverwood like a benevolent tyrant with an Excel sheet for a heart and a personal vendetta against whimsy. She didn't just enforce rules, she embodied them. She was the reason you couldn't plant perennials before April 15 or hang a wreath after January 7th. Tradition, she told me later with a tight smile, is what separates civilization from chaos, which I suppose made me the barbarian at the gate. Little did she know, I didn't just bring luggage. I brought spreadsheets, attorneys, and a very expensive habit of pushing back when told to sit down. 2 days after I moved in, I learned something profoundly disturbing about Silverwood Estates. Trash cans are political. Not political in the national sense. No one here's debating foreign policy at the curb. But apparently, setting your bins 2 inches past the invisible containment zone is enough to trigger a neighborhood inquisition. I woke up to a bright orange violation notice taped to my garage door, complete with highlighter scribbles, arrows, and what looked suspiciously like a diagram of my driveway. Section 4.3, Refuse Receptacle Compliance. It sounded like something from a dystopian novel about sentient garbage. Naturally, I went to check my security footage because I didn't remember anyone even being on my property. That's when things got weird. 15 minutes of footage, right around noon, completely gone. Just a blank feed. Before and after, crystal clear. Middle of the day, nada, not even a squirrel. In the back gate, slightly ajar, like someone with a clipboard and questionable morals had made a quick exit. I stood there holding my coffee like it was a crime scene artifact, thinking, did someone actually sneak in here to measure my trash cans? Because if they did, that's not just petty, that's a talent. And then came the packet, a 172-page HOA document, printed on paper so thick it could be weaponized, slid under my front door like a mafia threat wrapped in legalese. It was titled Silverwood Community Aesthetic and Behavioral Guidelines, which felt a little aggressive for a neighborhood with birdhouses and driveway chalk. Whole sections were highlighted neon yellow with notes like, new resident, monitor closely, and unclean window, treatment tint. I didn't know whether to laugh or start a resistance movement. As I was outside debating whether to burn the packet or frame it, a woman from across the street walked over carrying a bottle of wine and the universal expression for, bless your heart, you don't know what you just walked into. Her name was Linda Sparks. Late 40s, yoga pants, flip-flops, and the kind of warm sarcasm that makes you instantly trust her. Saw the notice, she said, nodding toward my trash bins. Don't worry, everyone gets one. It's like a Silverwood initiation. I raised an eyebrow. Is the next step hazing? She grinned. Only if you try to repaint your shutters. That's when she really loses it. Linda lowered her voice. Karen's thorough. Obsessive, really. She says she's protecting property values, but most of us think she just needs a hobby that doesn't involve clipboards. She glanced over her shoulder before adding, you might want to double-check your security cams. I've had mine tampered with before. I almost laughed until I realized she wasn't kidding. What, like someone just reaches up and blocks the lens? She nodded. Or smears petroleum jelly on it. Once, I swear, I found a cotton swab stuck in the housing. I blinked. So she's not just a HOA president, she's a stealth operative? Linda took a sip of wine, straight from the bottle. Welcome to Silverwood. As I stood there watching the sun set over what should have been a peaceful cul-de-sac, I realized two things. One, I wasn't dealing with a bored retiree. I was dealing with a woman who ran this neighborhood like it was her personal Sims game. And two, if this was just the welcome committee, I couldn't wait to see what came next. By the end of my first week in Silverwood, my mailbox was no longer a source of bills and promotional pizza coupons. It had become a portal for psychological warfare. One fine Thursday morning, I opened it to find a neat stack of envelopes, each bearing the golden HOA crest, like it was a royal decree. 5 violations, not 1, not 2, 5. For a moment, I thought they had accidentally delivered someone else's HOA doom spiral to my address. Nope, all mine. Violation 1, unauthorized window treatment coloration. Violation 2, sidewalk debris accumulation. Violation 3, grass height exceeds 3 inches. The remaining 2 were so absurd I had to read them twice. Excessive garage door sound during operation and mailbox not exhibiting approved neutral tones. Neutral tones, sorry, for a mailbox. I swear my mailbox had never offended anyone. Naturally, I checked my security footage again. This time, not only was there another convenient gap in the footage, exactly between 10:43 and 11:12, but the back gate was clearly ajar. Not wind blew it ajar, more like someone with gardening gloves and boundary issues ajar. I replayed it 4 times just to be sure. There was also a faint imprint in the grass near the hedges, not quite a footprint, more like a loafer print. You don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to know when your privacy is being invaded by a size 8.5 orthopedic wedge. That evening, I brought the stack of violations to Linda Sparks' house, along with a bottle of whiskey and the energy of a man who had just been fined $2,500, 0 cents for owning decorative planters that disrupt community cohesion. She took one look and poured us both a drink. 3 families moved out last year, she said, flipping through the fines like they were playing cards. Home guy tried to challenge her. His mailbox disappeared, like gone. I raised an eyebrow. What kind of HOA mafia is this? She sighed. Karen doesn't just enforce the rules, she becomes the rules. You either bend, break, or pack. We sat in silence for a moment, both sipping, both stewing. You know, she added, before she became queen of lawn coats, Karen was normal. After her husband passed, something changed. HOA gave her purpose, but now it's her personality. I nodded slowly. You ever think about running against her? Linda laughed so hard she nearly choked. You think people want to vote? Half this neighborhood can't even agree on what kind of mulch to use. The next morning, I drafted a formal response letter to the HOA. Respectful, articulate, and filled with just enough sarcasm to be legally considered polite. I stated my intent to comply with any legitimate concerns, but requested clarification on how the inspection team had accessed my backyard without notice or permission. I printed it on thick, embossed letterhead, signed it with a Mont Blanc pen, and dropped it in their designated complaint mailbox, which was ironically chipped and definitely not within neutral tone compliance. But here's the part I didn't mention in the letter. That afternoon, I started digging, not in my yard, but into Silverwood's HOA financials. A little casual online research, some municipal records, a coffee field trip to the county clerk's office. I wasn't just curious. I was preparing. Because when someone finds you $500, 0 cents for having dusty pavement, it's no longer about grass or mailboxes. It's about leverage. And I'd built a career finding the soft spot in billion-dollar contracts. I figured I could handle a spreadsheet tyrant in capri pants. The fines, I paid them, every last one, but not because I gave in. No, I paid them to buy myself silence, to buy time, to let Karen think she'd won the first round. Because as I slipped the check into the HOA slot, I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about my mom, who taught me to pick my battles and win them with receipts. What I refuse to spend is my dignity. The thing about HOA documents is no one reads them. They could sneak in clauses about mandatory jazzercise or seasonal llama parades, and 90% of residents would still nod and sign, which is probably why, while helping Amanda Wilson, the HOA's frazzled secretary, update the community website, I stumbled across a Google Drive folder labeled Shared. Clicking into it felt innocent enough. Inside were stock photos of trees, budget templates, and buried 3 layers deep, a file named operating budget underscore final underscore final 2, XMX. Always a good sign when there's 2 finals in the name. I opened it expecting a couple pie charts and maybe a passive-aggressive note about landscaping. Instead, I found chaos, budgets that didn't add up, vendors I'd never heard of, and line items like emergency fountain repair for $14,780, 0 cents, for a fountain that had been dry since the Bush administration. Then came the real kicker, recurring payments to Falcon Lawn Services, totaling over $130,000, 0 cents in 18 months. Jewish name, especially since Karen's nickname was the Silver Falcon. A little more digging, okay, fine. I reverse searched the 1099 form and boom, Falcon Lawn was registered under the name Bradley Beauregard, her nephew. Of course it was. I wasn't sure if I should laugh, cry, or audit the entire zip code. Instead, I scheduled lunch with Jared Ng, a former HOA legal advisor who now ran a small real estate law firm downtown. He wore a tie with pizza slices on it, which immediately made me trust him. I showed him the spreadsheet and asked one simple question. Is this normal? Jared blinked. No. This is what happens when nobody checks the math and someone treats HOA money like their personal smoothie fund. He went on to explain that Karen had repeatedly refused formal audits during her tenure. 3 requests, 3 rejections. The last one was apparently dismissed on the grounds of excessive negativity. But wait, it got juicier. Jared casually mentioned something about HOA debts being collateralized. I paused. What kind of collateral? He hesitated. Well, in some cases, HOAs can pledge common areas, parks, streets, clubhouses as backing for loans. I stared at him. You're telling me Karen may have mortgaged the actual streets of Silverwood? Jared shrugged. I've seen crazier. You'd need to check with the county land records, but I was already pulling out my phone and texting Linda. We were going on a field trip. The next morning at the county records office, which smelled like toner and broken dreams, I pulled the file on Silverwood Estates. My hands actually shook. There it was. 3 years ago, The HOA had taken a loan for $1,800,000, 0 cents, supposedly for infrastructure revitalization, and used all public land as collateral. Streets, sidewalks, parks, even the glorified gazebo behind the community center. I sat back, stunned. The HOA wasn't just broke, it was dancing on the edge of a foreclosure cliff. I drove home in silence, the absurdity of it all simmering in my brain. Karen had built her kingdom on smoke, mirrors, and mulch receipts, and now it was crumbling. I called Jordan Blackwell, longtime investor friend and CEO of First National Bank, the same bank that held Silverwood's debt. After explaining the situation, I asked the one question that could flip the entire game board. Can I buy the note? There was a pause. Then Jordan chuckled. Still finding new ways to stir the pot, huh, Caleb? I grinned. I don't need to stir anything, Jordan. I just need to sign the right piece of paper. The morning I signed the papers to purchase Silverwood's debt, I decided to take the Rolls-Royce out for a victory lap. I rarely drove it, too flashy for a neighborhood where people fought over mulch color, but after weeks of HOA nonsense and spreadsheet espionage, I figured I earned one self-indulgent highway cruise. I'd just taken the on-ramp to Highway 17, radio on, sunglasses on, when the hood of my car made a sound no luxury vehicle should ever make. Boom. At first, I thought I'd hit a pothole, a very angry, flaming pothole. The engine groaned, the dashboard blinked like a Christmas tree in crisis, and thick black smoke began pouring out from under the hood. I yanked the steering wheel hard and swerved to the shoulder, barely missing a Prius and what I'm fairly certain was someone mid-Zoom call in the passenger seat. The car stopped. The smoke didn't. I barely had time to unbuckle before flames licked around the wheel wells. I bailed out of that car faster than a cat leaving a bathtub and stood on the gravel shoulder, watching a $400,000 0-cent status symbol turn into a very expensive bonfire. 15 minutes later, firefighters arrived, along with a highway patrol officer who looked at the smoldering wreckage and said, "Well, that's not your average engine failure." A day later, a forensic inspector confirmed it. The car had been sabotaged. Specifically, someone had installed a modified military-grade ignition charge in the fuel system. Not big enough to kill, just enough to cause a blaze. It was professionally done, he said, like we were reviewing a paint job. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Cue police involvement. They traced the device back to a known contractor, Frank Moreau, ex-EOD specialist with a history of freelance, let's call it creative demolition. No one hires Frank for party balloons. Payment for the job transferred from a shell account tied to a local business, Silver Falcon Consulting. It didn't take a PhD in sarcasm to guess who that belonged to. I sat in my kitchen staring at the report, one sentence burning brighter than the rolls. Funded by B. Beauregard, Karen's nephew. Again, that night, I poured myself a drink, sat on the porch and watched the sprinklers in my front lawn mist over the neighborhood like nothing had happened. Somewhere behind a curtain, I imagined Karen sipping chamomile tea, still wearing pearls, totally unaware her plan had backfired. Or maybe not unaware, maybe she was sitting in the dark waiting for the call that never came. Either way, the message was clear. I wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. I was a threat, and she wasn't trying to find me into submission. She was trying to scare me off the board. You'd think HOAs just send passive-aggressive letters. Try the one that hires a bomb tech. The Silverwood Community Center smelled like weak coffee and stronger opinions. Folding chairs had been set up in neat rows, each one occupied by a resident who looked both curious and slightly afraid that Karen would fine them for blinking too loudly. At the front of the room was a projector, and next to it, Karen Beauregard, wearing a pantsuit so crisp it could slice deli meat. She was armed with a USB drive and a smile that said, "I'm still in control." Spoiler alert, she wasn't. I walked in with a folder under my arm, calm expression, and the confidence of a man who knew exactly what kind of bombshell he was about to drop, figuratively this time. Jordan Blackwell from the bank had joined me, along with Amanda Wilson from the HOA board, and Jared, our very chill lawyer with his pizza tie. A few residents waved at me, a few avoided eye contact. Everyone was bracing for something. Karen opened the meeting with a PowerPoint presentation titled "Maintaining Silverwood Standards in a Time of Disruption." Subtle. Slide after slide showed my property, annotated like it was a crime scene. One had a red circle around a lone dandelion in my front yard labeled potential invasive species. Another had a timestamped photo of me putting out the trash. We have to consider the broader implications of rule breaking, she announced. It's about trust, order, and aesthetics. That was my cue. I stepped up and asked for the mic. Karen hesitated, then handed it over like she was surrendering a sword. Thanks, Karen, I said with a nod. Now let's talk about aesthetics of financial fraud. I pulled up my slides. The room went quiet. First, I showed the Falcon Lawn Services payments. Then, the loan documents mortgaging the streets. Then, the forensic report on the car explosion. At that point, Karen's smile began to twitch. I could practically hear pearls tightening around her throat. There was a moment, right after the third slide, where you could feel the room shift. Eyes widened, mouths opened. One man whispered, "She what?" I played the voicemail from the bank, confirming I had legally purchased all Silverwood's common areas. I showed the contracts, the vendor trail, the unexplained invoices, and finally the note that tied her nephew to the car incident. No shouting, no theatrics, just quite clear receipts. And then I did something no one expected. I looked at Karen and said, "I'm not pressing charges." The room froze. Karen blinked, confused. "You're not?" someone asked. I shook my head. "No, because this isn't about punishment. It's about repair. We don't need another tyrant. We need a system that works." I proposed a full board election, open audits, and a governance structure that required community input, mandatory term limits, quarterly transparency meetings, pizza at every vote if necessary. That part got actual applause. Karen sat in silence. For the first time since I met her, she looked small. The neighbors who used to nod at her like she was the queen of suburbia now whispered behind their hands. Linda, sitting in the second row, gave me a quiet thumbs up. Even Bill Foster, who once warned me to just go along, stood up and said, "I think it's time for a change." The vote passed unanimously. The HOA board would be dissolved, effective immediately, and elections scheduled for the fall. As everyone filed out of the room, murmuring, hugging, and trying to figure out what just happened, I stayed back. Karen walked past me without a word, gripping her purse like it held the last thread of her authority. Amanda approached and asked, "How do you feel?" I thought for a moment and replied, "Like I won." But then I looked at the chair Karen had just vacated, still warm with her presence, and added quietly, "But I don't want to become what I just took down." The week following the vote felt like the first real spring in Silverwood. Lawns looked a little greener, conversations lasted longer, people actually waved without checking the angle of their neighbors' hedges. It was as if the HOA curse had lifted, and we were remembering that this place was in theory a community, not a gated reality show with lawn citations. The new election was held in the community park. No suits, no PowerPoints, just picnic tables, clipboards, and lemonade that may or may not have been spiked. We created a new council system from the 6 aggressives with 5 residents from different corners of the neighborhood, rotating terms, open meetings, and mandatory financial transparency. HOA dues slashed by 30% immediately. Those overpriced contracts, gone. Amanda Wilson became financial chair. Linda took charge of outreach. Bill Foster, surprisingly, asked to oversee landscaping and took it as seriously as if he'd just been handed the Pentagon's irrigation system. For once, people were smiling because of Silverwood, not in spite of it. But the biggest surprise came when I stood up at the close of the meeting with one final proposal, a special role for Karen Beauregard. A few people audibly gasped. One guy dropped his paper plate. I continued anyway. "We've all seen the damage power can cause," I said. "But some of us also remember a time when Karen wasn't the woman with the fine. She was the woman with the potluck sign-ups, the park decorations, the Halloween hayride." I paused. "I'm creating a new, non-voting, honorary role. Director of Community Traditions. It comes with zero power and unlimited opportunities to connect people." There was silence, then a few murmurs, and then, unexpectedly, Michael Beauregard, Karen's son, stood up from the back. His voice shook. "She loved this neighborhood before it all spiraled. After Dad passed, this gave her purpose, but it became too much. She forgot where that purpose was supposed to lead." He wiped his eyes. Thank you for giving her a chance to remember. Karen didn't attend the meeting, but later that evening, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox. It simply read, "I'm sorry and thank you." That said more than 1,000 HOA memos ever could. Weeks passed, the new board got to work, residents pitched in for cleanups, and someone actually suggested building a tiny library instead of arguing about mailbox symmetry. At our first community-wide cookout, kids played in the newly renovated park, dogs were off leash, nobody cared. Karen showed up wearing pastel and holding a tray of lemon bars. She wasn't in charge, she was just there. Someone handed her the mic and she announced the return of Silverwood movie nights. People cheered. It was weird and kind of wonderful. I stood near the grill, flipping burgers and watching the sunset spill across the cul-de-sac like warm syrup. Linda walked over and asked, "You ever think this would be possible?" I laughed. "Honestly, I didn't even think I'd survive the trash can wars." She nudged me. "So what's next? Gonna buy another neighborhood?" I shook my head. "No, I think this one's enough." As the credits of Back to the Future played on the projector screen and neighbors gathered on picnic blankets, I looked around at the community we had rebuilt. Not through rage or revenge, but through choice, effort, and a little bit of absurd luck. I thought of my mom again, of what she taught me about standing your ground, but knowing when to offer a hand. And here's the truth. You don't have to buy a neighborhood to fight for justice. But if you do, use it to heal, not to rule. If there's one thing this wild ride taught me, it's that power without accountability turns even a bake sale queen into a clipboard-wielding tyrant. But real leadership, it looks like shared barbecue, open budgets, and neighbors who wave without filing a report. You don't need millions or a Rolls Royce to make change. Just the guts to say, yeah, this is nuts, and do something about it, whether it's your HOA, your office, or your fantasy football league. Speak up, show up, and don't let the Karens of the world run unchecked. If you laughed, gasped, or screamed into a throw pillow during this story, do me a favor, hit that like button, drop your craziest HOA moment in the comments, and subscribe for more justice-flavored chaos. Because around here, we believe revenge is best served with receipts and a side of potato salad.